Hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this very important and exciting discussion with Premier David Burt from Bermuda. He's going to share with us the important reforms and policies that he's implementing in his country to take his country forward. Welcome, Premier Burt. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Marla, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. And I just wanted to also congratulate you. As far as I'm aware, I'm not sure if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're the youngest premier/prime minister in this region. That, I think, is a very important thing to highlight because your country is doing so much in the area of technology, and I want to applaud you for that and congratulate you for holding this record.
Well, thank you very much. I don't feel as young now as I used to be. I'm almost 5 years into this role, so it's certainly been a long haul, but certainly technology is important to me, as that is my background. And as we press forward through times of a pandemic and now moving forward into a very difficult global economic situation, we all need to work together. And so looking forward to the next challenge.
Great. So, Premier, let me get straight into the questions that I have for you today. So your country, Bermuda, has one of the highest GDP per capita in this hemisphere. But of course, you guys are not immune to the pandemic effects, for example, and other global phenomena such as the global inflationary pressures. Tell us, how is your government addressing or counteracting these challenges that we're all currently facing?
Well, Bermuda has, as I would say, a two-pillar economy. Our main source of foreign exchange earnings is actually international business. We have a very large and globally renowned insurance sector in Bermuda. And at the same time, we also have a tourism sector. And so the pandemic certainly had a massive impact on the side of tourism. But what we saw was an opposite effect on the side of our international business sector, particularly because whenever there are large global risk events that create the type of dislocation that we saw with the pandemic, we see additional risk capital flow in to start and form new companies. So during the time of the pandemic, we actually saw a 10% increase in the total number of people employed in international business in Bermuda. So a significant increase in the number of jobs of which we saw. And from that perspective, while we did see a decrease on the tourism side, and the tourism side is going to take a while to recover, certainly from the perspective of making sure that we get hotels back open, new investment and hotel development taking place. So it's been I don't want to call it a mixed bag. We've seen growth and strength in financial services. Certainly our burgeoning digital asset space is certainly beginning to take hold. And so from that aspect, there are positives which are happening there. But tourism itself is a negative. On the side of inflation, it's a very interesting circumstance. And I say that because when we look at how inflation is calculated in any country, it's calculated on, the basket of goods that people consume on a daily basis, on a regular basis, and what is the percentage of that. And one of the biggest inputs to that in Bermuda, which is a little bit larger than other countries, is actually the cost of rents, the cost of housing. So, housing is factored into it. The cost of auto vehicles are factored into it, food, energy, those type of things. And the inflation of which we're seeing in the United States, in Europe, and in Canada, possibly in other places, are largely driven to, of course, the very loose monetary policy that was in place after the pandemic. Bermuda does not have the ability to print its own currency, so we can only use what we earn in foreign exchange. So that's the first instance. And then the second instance is, of course, there's different geopolitical factors that are taking place, not just the war in Ukraine, but also changes in migration and immigration policy, both in the United Kingdom due to Brexit and also the United States due to certain items there. So we're seeing chronic labor shortages, which is, of course, driving up those costs. We are not seeing the chronic labor shortages here in Bermuda, and we are not seeing a big increase in the price of rents. And so that in itself has a basket. So as in the US, where they're predicting, about 6-7% inflation this year, and it's taking a bite out of both the money which you spend in the grocery store, but also the money that you have to pay to keep a roof over your head in Bermuda. We have seen our rents being stable during this period in time, actually a small decrease year over year, whereas we've seen the increase on certainly goods. When it comes to energy, what the government has adopted is, at least on the most widely used energy in the country, which is gasoline and diesel for cars, bikes, and for trucks for businesses. We implemented a policy in February that fuel prices will be frozen, and so that we will not allow them to increase at the pump. And so we're reducing our taxes to compensate. So energy taxes are being reduced in the amount to ensure that fuel prices, because fuel prices are done on a global basis, that fuel prices at the pump do not increase for businesses and also for residents. So that's how we are looking to address those particular issues. But we are certainly not immune, but our situation is different. And we are continuing to plow ahead with housing developments, continuing to plow ahead with affordable housing, and continuing to look at how we even continue to increase the amount of housing stock that's on island. Because we'll get to this later, speaking about our changing demographics, but I think it's important to note and to understand that from our perspective, we have to plan for a different type of future and to make sure that we look at labor differently in the country, because you see the dangers of what labor shortages causes. Labor shortages contribute to inflation, and when you have labor shortages, and inflation is something that negatively affects all persons inside of a country.
Absolutely. And actually, maybe we dovetail right now to the question on demographics, because it's a nice segue, because basically we have, not just in Bermuda, but across the region, this population that is aging rapidly. And by 2026, which is just a few years, the majority of the population in your country will be senior citizens. And in order to buck this trend, you have to build a society where people want to stay and live and work if you want to maintain the population size or grow the population size and continue to contribute to nation building, whether citizens or whether expatriate workers. And also, maybe it's not just a question, I think, of perpetually growing the pie, meaning GDP, but maybe also redistributing that pie more evenly. That's also something that I think as policymakers need to think about when they think about this question of growth as it relates to the demographic shifts. How does your government intend to address and counteract this problem of this aging population?
Well, aging population is a very complex issue, and it's interesting because we define it as an aging population because of the historical construct of where senior citizens are, and when pension programs came into place in the 60s and 70s, it was always around the age of 65, and those are seniors, and that's where that comes. But over history and in time, the population has always aged because technology has become better. Different things medicine has become better, knowledge has become better on health, and individuals continue to live longer lives. And I do not see that trend continuing. So it's a question of how do you adjust the way in which you look at the way that your economy is, the way in which you treat aging, and the way in which you look at it. And I think that one of the policies that we have in Bermuda is called Aging Well. And you want to make sure that people age well. But I think, and I will just draw a parallel to certainly the wonderful country of Barbados. So I did travel. We were speaking before, of course, we went live, that I was in Barbados we'll call it in April, for a conference with U.S. congresspersons and also leaders of the region, CARICOM heads of governments and Minister of Finance, discussing the issues of which you know so well about anti-money laundering and I would say the discriminatory treatment that is given to islands in the Caribbean. But at that, I was pleasantly surprised when I was taking the car from the airports to the hotel, and the close protection officer, I was talking about various issues. And we went into a conversation about the population in the country because my assistant had never been to Barbados before. She asked about the population. And he was talking, well, that's a big debate right now, what the population should be. And he said something which was interesting. He said the old age dependency ratio And I was stunned because, that's not the type of conversation, that's levels of, statisticians and all the rest, not just a regular conversation which you have. But I think that it's interesting to note that the conversation in Barbados is there. Now, I raise that because that is exactly what it is that we're doing in Bermuda, because oftentimes there are these conversations that are speaking about, just raw numbers. Oh, we need 70,000 people, we need 80,000 people, we need this many people. We need to look at it from the perspective of this is the economy we wish to have. This is what is needed in order to provide the services for persons. And in order for that, our population needs to be this many people, our workforce needs to be this large in order to continue to make sure that we maintain that standard of living. Because as you started by saying, Bermuda has one of the highest per capita GDPs in the hemisphere. That is correct. But if there is not the classic continuation of economic growth, which I'm a classical believer in classical economics, so I believe that economic growth equals population growth plus productivity. There's other persons who will say things, oh, you can't leave out investment, et cetera. I get all of those things. But at the end of the day, if your population is not growing, you will be difficult to have continued economic growth. And so from that perspective, we are looking at analyzing it from an old age dependency ratio. What's also important is that we have to have sustainability in our long-term pensions. And a lot of countries do not have sustainability in their long-term pensions. So we've been undergoing a review on our long-term pensions. This was announced, I want to say, in maybe 2019 in the budget statement. I'm now back here in the Ministry of Finance, and we are reviewing the proposals, and we intend to bring those to the Parliament in November. But of course, that's going to deal with the issues. There's only certain fixes of which you can do for pensions. You either reduce payouts, you increase the retirement age, or you change certain things in regards to the reference period, et cetera. And so we're looking at how we can make our pensions sustainable for the future while taking into account, of course, population growth and the ratios like old age dependency ratio, things like that, which we're trying to target. So aging is, it's a multifaceted aspect, but you want to focus on people living well, living better, having access to more preventative care, while also making sure that your economy is growing to take care of the more senior citizens that are requiring assistance in their health in, I guess, the senior years. About the equity of the pie is something else which you said. Bermuda has one of the most unfair tax systems on the planet. And this has nothing to do with corporate taxes and all those matters. It has to do with domestic taxation. And so from domestic taxation, it's one of the things that the Bermuda government is committed to tackling. And so our Tax Reform Commission is going to be taking the recommendations of the Fiscal Responsibility Panel and making sure we analyze on how to ensure that we have a more fair and equitable tax system. Because the only taxes that we have in Bermuda really there's no one in Bermuda will say they're under tax. Businesses, anyone, we will not say we're under tax. That is for certain. But I think the question is the distribution of those taxes and where do those taxes fall. And proportionally, as we see in this country, persons who are low wage earners pay a much bigger chunk of their total pay than high wage earners or persons who have income from other sources. And that is something that must be addressed urgently as a matter of, I think, assistance, not only for to make sure that it's more equal in the country, more fair, more balanced, but I think those can also tackle some of the challenges that we also have, such as the high cost of living in Bermuda.
Wow, yes, quite a mouthful, and thank you for all of that detail. And you touched on a whole lot of subjects there. And of course, one of the most critical things is making sure that the unsustainable pension systems, as you mentioned, does not then become a burden on the fiscal revenue of the government. And you mentioned the Fiscal Responsibility Panel, and your independent fiscal responsibility panel recently delivered their 7th report for 2021 a few months ago. This is not something that's common across the Caribbean. So I would like to just ask you to explain a bit about how this independent fiscal responsibility panel came about and how it functions, please. Because I think that this is an important institution that I feel all of us should have. So I'd love to hear from you how yours came about and how it functions.
Thanks. I think one of the most important things when it comes to good governance is having independent bodies that can report and to provide I would say, advice to the parliament, to the country, and to allow people to be able to hold their governments to account. I mean, politics, I'm a politician, clearly. Politics is something that things get lost in the rhetoric and the back and forth. But when you have independent bodies, and this is something you'll find common, whether I think it's the United Kingdom, it's the Office of Budget Responsibility. In the United States, the Congressional Budget Office, there's these type of independent scoring agencies and things that look at things and say, these are the type of things of which you may want to do, may want to consider. So this was actually set up, I want to say, in 2014, 2015, by the former government of something that will make recommendations on an annual basis and then report to the country on whether or not the recommendations that they are making are being followed. It's something that I continue with when I came in as Premier and Minister of Finance. And it's something which I think adds value to the country. And I think what adds value is that it allows a dispassionate look at the issues and just speaking of the facts that these are the problems and there's only so many fixes to the problems. Because many times in public discourse and in politics, people will come up with unrealistic solutions for problems. And it's difficult. Governance is hard. It's hard telling people that, in order for your pension to be there in the future, that the retirement age is going to be after risen. It's hard telling people that in order for there to be lower inflation or lower cost of living in the country, that we have to relax our immigration system to make sure there's more workers into the country that can make sure sustain economic growth and things. Those are difficult matters, but it's often assisted from a policy perspective if there is an independent viewpoint that is informing that, and not just the back and forth political debate and discussion, which sometimes gets, I would say, distorted due to differing agendas. So I like to say that I'm a politician, but I love to deal with policy. And when we're looking at the policies which are necessary to bring long-term economic growth, it's important that there's an independent voice that is grading the government and saying, these are the things the government should consider to do, because they are unpopular things, but they are what is necessary in order to ameliorate the challenges that you have in the short term to make sure that you do have a long-term future.
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. And these are difficult conversations that people need to be having. The leadership need to be having with the electorate, with the population before it's too late. And sometimes they don't have the courage to do that. But in support of this independent fiscal panel, you also have a fiscal rules framework. Could you tell us whether you plan to change any, which ones exist already, and do you plan to change any of these fiscal rules going forward?
No, we don't plan on changing the fiscal rules. I mean, the fiscal rules which were set out as targets in, I want to say, 2015 in the initial report of the Fiscal Responsibility Panel. And they deal with, our debt to revenue ratio, our debt to GDP ratio, getting those things under control. But of course, everyone's playbook got thrown out in March of 2020 with the onset of a global pandemic. Yep. So we have seen debt levels increase across the world, and we see the remnants of the stuff which is coming behind. But what I think is important to note is that no, we do not intend on throwing out the fiscal rules, but what we want to make sure to do is that we can achieve those fiscal rules in a sustainable way. And the best way to achieve them in a sustainable way, as I said, is to execute on the government's economic recovery plan, which was announced in 2021, to make sure that we build the economy, to make the economy more fair, and to make it sustainable in the long term, which is vital and important. Don't want to do short-term fixes. And that will take us to the space where we want to get to. So our plan is to balance the budget in the 2024, 2025 fiscal year. That's a year later than was predicted at the onset of our fiscal responsibility, at the onset of our economic recovery plan. However, it's important to note that the total amount of accumulated deficits over the period of time from the pandemic to getting our budget back into balance was predicted to be $425 million. And we're looking at coming in at about $410 million. So even though we've taken longer to balance the budget, we have not accumulated as much debt as we said. So instead of the glide path being like this, it's going to be a little bit more shallow because you have to have cushion, because you also need investment in order to invest in economic growth. And of course, cutting off and choking off investment, reducing domestic demand through government spending when you have reduced tourism spending on the island can lead to longer term economic pressure. So that's the perspective which we're taking, but there is no plan to change the fiscal rules. There's the plan to set long-term targets. And the way that I look at it is we want to increase our revenues, and we certainly want to decrease our debt burden to hit the most difficult target of all, which is the debt to revenue ratio.
Right. So you talked about when you're going to balance your budget, and it's quite ambitious, but it seems as though you're getting closer to achieving it. The next question I want to ask, and you talked about your debt to revenue target. You have net debt that is just over $3 billion, and the debt to revenue ratio that you just mentioned is over 300%. And this is well in excess of your target of about 80%. However, you still have a primary fiscal surplus, which is a comfortable position to be in, and debt servicing is costing about $130 million per annum, despite relatively low interest rates. I'm seeing about 2.4 to 5.7%, and your debt to GDP is around 46%. So some of these are quite enviable statistics from a regional perspective. But do you consider this debt level to be unsustainable, and your debt to revenue ratio? Do you consider it to be unsustainable? And if so, why? And if not, why?
Well, I don't consider the debt to be unsustainable, but what I do consider unsustainable is increasing accumulations of deficits that increase the debt. So I think that the debt level which we have is not a position that the government wants to be in. When I came into office in 2017, the country was stunned and our detractors were stunned because we did not increase the debt ceiling. We said that we're not going to increase the debt ceiling. And at that point in time, the debt ceiling was 2.5 billion. We said that we're not going to increase the debt ceiling and we're going to go ahead and press forward. And we actually did not increase the debt ceiling until a deal which was signed by the former government, which required a guarantee, was called. And the government of Bermuda did have to go to the markets to get money to pay off that guarantee. And then, of course, there was the pandemic. With all of that being said, what is most important is to focus on the reduction of the debt over the long term. But I think what's most important is to get yourself in a place where you are generating enough funds, where your credit ratings can increase, so your interest costs can even come down further. From the Bermuda perspective, I mean, we've done pretty good liability management of our debt, and so there's significant debt that has to be refinanced in the near future. But if you look at what's happening with Bermuda's debt, which is traded on global markets, we are known as a good credit story. And the important thing to be known as a good credit story is to set targets, to meet targets, and to explain what it is that you're doing. And so from the perspective that our economy is performing better than some of the ratings agencies would have expected, certainly due to the fact of our very strong international business sector and the fact that that international business sector continues to grow. I think what you will see is that we will, when in the next few years, as we keep a very tight lid on spending while making sure to increase revenue, not through increased taxation, but through economic growth in the country, the return of tourism, what you will find there is that we'll be able to certainly meet those budget targets to get to a balanced budget. So we start to reduce the debt. Debt reduction certainly reduces it. But as you said, we do have a current account. We do have a primary surplus. The country has always had a current account surplus. Bermuda does not have pressure in that regard because we certainly always earn more foreign currency than we expend. So we have lots of things that are certainly in our favor. But the debt thing is one part about it.
So let's just talk about how we're going to get there in terms of balancing the budget and achieving a surplus so that we can start to bring the debt level down. Tell us about some of your main expenditure reforms and your main revenue reforms that you're implementing and no taxes, right? Your main revenue reforms that you're implementing to achieve this goal.
Well, on the revenue side, there is the Tax Reform Commission, which was brought into law in 2020. This is the second Tax Reform Commission in the space of 5 years. Of course, this was after the pandemic, so we find ourselves where we are in a situation where we have to take a look at how we do things differently to be sustainable over the long term. And of course, as you know, Bermuda is an international financial center, and there is a proposed global minimum tax.
Yes.
Now that is something that is off to the side. We don't know what may happen of that. The agreement was signed, but they're still working through the technical details, so we don't know when the implementation timeline of that may be. But as I said earlier, we also have issues that have been raised by our fiscal responsibility panel in regards to domestic taxation. The government's goals are to make sure that our tax system is more fair, but that Bermuda remains a competitive economy and one where people can live, invest, and feel secure about their futures. And so that's what we're going to do on the tax policy side, review that to make our tax system more fair, but not in a view to try to significantly increase the overall tax burden. Our fiscal responsibility panel says the tax burden in Bermuda right now is 17%. It should be higher, about 22%. We'll see what the Tax Reform Commission recommends. I think, as I spoke earlier about independent commissions, I think that it's important that governments do not set out what they want to be recommended. They say, these are the parameters, and let the persons who you've tasked with that responsibility to come back and present in plain face the options of what can be there. On the expenditure side, however, expenditure side is always focused on government efficiency, increased investments from a government of Bermuda perspective in technology, but not only increased investments in the area of technology, just continuing to make sure that government is more efficient with what it does. So we've been in a place where we've basically frozen the size of government. In 2022, the government is the exact same size, thereabouts, about 0.5% one way or the other, as where it was in 2017. We are certainly very focused on making sure that the government continues to be efficient, holding the line on spending while making sure that we invest in economic growth that can generate more tax revenues through growth and not necessarily through additional taxation. And so our budget predicts that we're only going to see expenditure increase by 0.5% next year and 1.5% in the years following overall expenditure, while we're predicting revenue increases of 4% next year and 5% the year following the return of full-scale tourism, and then 3% per year thereafter, in line with just economic growth forecasts.
Wow, that's an incredible agenda. And I mean, we're observing, economies reopening and tourism coming back across the board. So there's no reason to doubt that that's going to help you with your revenue. And it's quite interesting that you seem to have a natural, well, it's not natural, but you have this sort of a risk management mechanism where your financial services sector performs well when your tourism is not, as we saw during the pandemic. That's brilliant. And in a small country when there's not a lot that we can do, you're very fortunate to be in that position where you have that. And this is the whole idea behind diversification, right? So Premier, thank you so much for spending your time with me today.
Can I just add one more thing on that? Because I think that it's important.
Of course, please do.
Absolutely. When we talk about the economy and when we talk about, how do you do things, it goes back to the whole issue of, I think that governance works better when governments don't limit themselves just to ideas from their own political party, from their own particular view. And so one of the things which we did with with the pandemic came, we launched an economic advisory council. We also had a youth economic advisory council, and then we got external resources to assist in the formulation of the government's economic recovery plan. And the economic recovery plan covered 31 key initiatives that must be executed in order to have this long-term growth. Because you can have budgets, but if you don't actually have a long-term plan that you are successfully executing a long-term strategy, you can find yourself constantly mired in this short-term thinking. And so the perspective of which we looked at it is that we know that the short-term issues that we have here insofar as a downward trend through the pandemic and a slight upward trend in regards to the recovery of tourism. But how do you position yourself for the long term, recognizing that the world is certainly changing? And so, from a tourism perspective, from an international financial services perspective, where, people don't necessarily have to live in your country in order to conduct business with your country. They weren't able to travel and business didn't skip a beat. Our insurance company still went on. The Bermuda Monetary Authority was still issuing licenses, still doing the work of which it did, but everyone was at home and no one was in office. And so that in itself presents a risk to your business model, because if your business model, like us, is gaining tax revenue and foreign direct investment and GDP growth by the companies that are here, by the people that are in the country, by the people who are working, who are paying rents, who are paying food, who are contributing to your consumption-based tax system. If that falls away, then you certainly have a problem. So when we're looking at it from the economic recovery plan perspective, is not just the short term about how are the technical things we fix, but the long-term investments of which you need to have in order for there to be growth in 5 years and 10 years down the road. And so what we found ourselves doing is looking at our strengths. Bermuda's strength, strangely enough, is regulation. It sounds really weird for people to say that your strength is regulation, but our Bermuda Monetary Authority is regarded as one of the best financial services regulators in the country. But what we've done is that we've expanded that to look at other places where we can be successful in regulation, be swift in regulation, where other countries may be slow. One of the areas of which we're focused on our economic recovery plan is energy. And so in Parliament tomorrow, we'll be debating what we call amendments to the Electricity Act. But this is going to be creating an energy regulatory sandbox, which will allow persons to come and test different types of energy in the country. And our first project is an actual tidal energy project. So there's lots of things which we have in our economic recovery plan, which is 31 different points, everything from the launch of Bermuda's casino sector to vertical farming to provide long-term food security, to youth employment strategy, which the Minister of Labor just did a press conference announcing to make sure that we can take care of the future generations of persons, to constructing more housing and making sure that we change our labor markets in the country so that we can have more people living and working here. So it's a comprehensive long-term plan, and governments must have long-term plans and have the courage to execute those long-term plans in order to provide long-term economic growth. So that's why we're so comfortable with our projections, because we've set up a specific office to make sure we execute those plans. Governments will continue to do the things that we do on a daily basis, but if you do not focus energy on implementation, on critical plans which you put in place, you can find yourself down the road not hitting your targets. And that's one of the things which we're focused on. So that's why we're comfortable in hitting these long-term targets and making sure that we actually transform our economy and not just rely on what we've always had and what may come, because the world is going to look different after the pandemic. And if countries don't change, they will certainly be challenged in a few years. It might look good now in 1 or 2 years, but as you see with inflation, now with us, inflation, we are increasing our domestic food production to have less reliance on overseas items. And it's things like that that countries must do.
Wow, Premier, I mean, if I could have voted in your country, I'll say, you have my vote. These are the kinds of initiatives and reforms that I think are so important to transform your economy and so important for countries like ours. I congratulate you. I wish you all the best of success. And I'm glad that you're also focusing on implementation, because that's sometimes we have the best made plans, and sadly we lack in implementation and execution in this part of the world. So I congratulate you for that. Thank you so much for spending time with me and sharing all of these very interesting, transformative, inspiring ideas and reforms that you're implementing in your country. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, Marla, it was my absolute pleasure, and I just want to commend you for the work of which you continue to in the region, continue to educate, continue to enlighten persons on particular issues, especially on issues concerning international financial centers. You are a gem in our wonderful region, and I'm so pleased to be with you today.
Oh. Thank you so much, Premier. And thank you to our viewers for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion with the Premier from Bermuda, David Burt, the youngest Premier/Prime Minister in this region. Very proud of you and the work you're doing. Thank you very much for the time. And we look forward to chatting with you again sometime soon to hear what's happening.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.